I love a good story of a testimony of a person's life who's been dramatically changed, transformed by the power of God. And one of the reasons why I've chosen the story of Rahab from Joshua chapter 2, it's quite a long chapter, but it's worth reading the whole chapter so we get it into context. One of the reasons I think Rahab is a good story is because it tells us the story of a person who is really lost in their life, coming to know God. And we'll know the story really, really well as Joshua sends out the spies into the land, and they come back and they say, yes, it's exactly how God said it would be, and with God's help we can take this. But they also come back and tell the story to Joshua about Rahab. I can't imagine for one moment as they went into this pagan land that they ever thought in their wildest dreams that they would come across somebody who would be expressing faith in the God of Israel. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And yet in the wisdom and the power and the providence of God, the sovereignty of God, God is always preparing people in their hearts. And I think Rahab is a little bit of proof of that God doesn't need our help. He's already bigger than that. And so Rahab's heart is already prepared to meet the people of God. And I think sometimes you and I are under this delusion that people don't want to know God. And yet God is always preparing people in their hearts to come to know him. So I can't imagine as the spies went into this land that they ever imagined that they would meet somebody who would start talking about their God and wanting to know more about him, even though they hadn't met God's people before. Now I love this story, and sometimes I wonder what Tom Jones would do if he read this story and he were to write a song. And maybe the first line would be something like this, and I'm not even going to try and sing it, but maybe Tom Jones would say, Rahab, Rahab, shady lady with her hips, her lips and her fingertips. Rahab, Rahab, shady lady. I don't know. It certainly wouldn't reach number one if I was singing it. But yes, she is a shady lady, but she doesn't stay a shady lady. She is somebody who turns from shady lady to priceless princess. And that's what I love about this story. Now, Rahab's story, it's very interesting because she confesses to the spies, Joshua 2 verse 9, I know God has given you this land. Even before she's met God's people or has had any contact with God himself, she has heard about the God of Israel, and she realizes in her heart that he is more powerful than she is or her own gods. And so there's a couple of things I want us to think about. First of all, Rahab's works. Now, she doesn't work to earn her salvation, but what she does with her life shows a very clear understanding that she wants to move away from her own life and join the people of God. So she hid the spies. She protected the spies. She put her life in the gap for the spies. She did what they said. She sent them on their way safe. She diverted her own people away from the spies. She made her choice to stand with the people of God. She was proving with her life through what she was doing. Her works proved that she was genuinely wanting to find out about God, and she was willing even to put her life on the line for that. Rahab's works. But she expresses more than just works. Works develop into faith. I know that your God has given you this land. There is a very clear faith, and her confession of faith is remarkable if we just examine that for a few moments. In Joshua 2 verse 10 she talks about the might of God, God's triumphant acts, his mighty hand, his strength, his active work. This is a pagan lady who hasn't had a Bible study. She's not even come across a Bible, and yet she is fully aware of the might and the power of God. In verse 11, she talks about the majesty of God. She says, your God is in the heavens above and on the earth. He is everywhere, yet he is one. In verses 12 to 13, she talks about the mercy of God. She pleads for her family. And she says, swear by the Lord's name, the Lord, not your people, but the Lord, that I will be protected. She knows whose name to confess for protection. Indeed, Romans 10 verse 17 says this, faith comes by hearing. Now, remember I said I can't imagine that the spies, as they went out into the land, ever imagined that they were going to find somebody who was halfway coming to become a believer in the God of Israel. Absolutely astonishing. So we see Rahab's works, and we see her faith. Can you imagine what some of her friends might say to her? They might say, Rahab, don't throw your life away to this strange group of people for some strange religion. Rahab, you're a successful businesswoman. Your business is doing well. You have property and prospects. She must have been quite a wealthy lady to have produce like flax and other harvest materials drying on her roof. That's quite a substantial property that she's got. But Rahab, in her faith, she turns away from her people. She turns away from her religion, her culture, her life, her whole future prospects. She turns away from everything. Rahab's faith. The way she's living her life already proves that she wants to follow God, but then she confesses those statements, and have a look at those statements. So in this story, who gets connected with God? A king? No. A nobleman? No. A city advanced in science and culture? The Canaanites were brilliant-minded people? No. A prostitute? Yes. Someone who is living on the edge of society responds to God. Who had the opportunity to change in this story? Everybody. If Rahab knew about the God of Israel and his mighty works, a testimony of what God had done for the people in getting them out of Egypt, then the whole city must have known about God. Who had the opportunity to change? They all did. Who responds? Everybody responds in this story, but only Rahab responds to God. Faith and repentance. It's interesting how the New Testament describes this part of history. In Hebrews 11 it says this, by faith Rahab was not killed with those who were disobedient. In James 2 verse 25 it says, Rahab is considered righteous by what she did with the spies. In other words, faith came into her life. Faith brought change of direction and belief. Rahab had faith, Jericho had fear. And so it's interesting. That's why I really love this story, because there's a very distinct testimony and conversion process that's going on in the life of Rahab. What about your life and story? Can you see those mirror images where you have actually turned away from your culture, your previous way of life, all the prospects that might have been good, and given up everything in order to follow God? So we've had Rahab's works, her faith, but what about her reward? Well, she protected the spies, death if caught. She diverted the king's guards, death if caught. She confessed Israel's God, death if caught. She repented from her society and sin and turned away from it all. She left everything. But Joshua hears about this, and in chapter 6 it says, only Rahab and her family shall live, because she hid the spies. And so Joshua makes sure that Rahab and her family come under the covering of their protection. In verse 23 it says, Rahab and her family were saved, and they were brought out by the two spies that she had sheltered. What a lovely story that is, that the two spies who offered her protection and salvation were the same ones that went back and brought her out into the protective fold of Israel. Now, the story also has a few other things that are worth mentioning. In chapter 6, verse 23, it says that Rahab and her family are placed outside the camp of Israel. She is physically saved, but this shady lady is still on the edge. She's on the edge of the worshipping community of God, but she's not part of them yet. And then just a few more verses down in chapter 6, verse 25, it says, Rahab and her family were saved and live in the midst of the camp of Israel to this day. That's why I love this story. Here's a shady lady who's living far away from God, living in a sinful culture. She's got no hope, but God sends two people to lead her to him. And she goes from being unknown by God in the sense of she's not following him, to living on the edge of the people of God, to living in the midst of the people of God. Have a look at your life and you'll see a similar thing. It's like the gospel in the Old Testament, and she is saved along with her family. Now, it's also interesting that as Rahab confesses the God of Israel, she's also making it very, very clear that her whole life and her own culture and her own culture's way of life have been built on a lie compared with the truth of the people of God and God himself. What about you? Where's your life in this? As you look at the life of Rahab and you can see those clear distinctive lines of Rahab and her family getting saved as she's expressed faith in him. Well, the story doesn't end there, because the fourth point is Rahab's inheritance. In Hebrews 11 verse 31 it says, Rahab the harlot did not perish as she welcomed the spies. And when you turn to Matthew's Gospel in chapter 1, you'll see names of 4 women there who are mentioned as part of Jesus's family tree. Only one of those is a Jewish lady, and that's Mary. The other 3 ladies are Gentiles. And it's interesting that as Rahab's life develops, she actually marries into the people of Israel and becomes part of Jesus's family tree. That is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? But guess what? You and I are also part of God's family tree. John's Gospel says this, that those who come to know God, those who put their trust in him, those who have faith in Jesus Christ, have the right to become children of God. Have another look at the story of this shady lady who used to practice with her hips, her lips and her fingertips, and yet she turns from shady lady to priceless princess. You see, the thing about following God is this, that for Rahab, her past is now dealt with. She is no longer a shady lady. She's not going back to that way of life anymore. Her past is dealt with because of God. Her present is blessed because she is now part of the worshipping community of God, and she is able to have access to God and worship God. And her future, that is secure, because one day she knew she would go to be with God. That's the gospel in the Old Testament, but we know it's the same gospel as Jesus presented through his life and works, that you and I too, our past will be dealt with through the power of the cross. Our present is blessed because we are part of the worshipping community of God and we have access to God, and our future is secure because one day, like Rahab, we will go to be with him. You don't have to be a shady lady. You don't have to be a bad man. You can come to know Christ and become a priceless princess or a priceless prince of Christ, because he will deal with your past and bless your present and secure your future. Well, that's why I've just got a few thoughts on Rahab there, and that's why I really love that story. And I would encourage you to look over that scripture and bring out those details for yourself. May God bless you with that.